How's that?
I think...
One day
I feel...
So...
Well, look, thank you.
Now, what would be my story if that was the case?
Oh, no,
So-
that's not what I meant.
You can, but I can't answer it.
And there was this indescribable welter of emotions. I think...
To this day,
I will never accept
It was
that.
like something that
Never.
just sort of snapped in my head.
And
Look, I don't know. It's a miracle.
and I hope that the people
Yeah.
listening to us will enjoy what they hear.
Conversations with Richard Fidler on ABC Local Radio.
Today, it's a conversation with one of the world's most popular writers, Bill Bryson. Bill is the author of so many best-selling books. A Short History of Nearly Everything, a book which explains how we got here from the Big Bang to the present day. His book Notes from a Small Island, which is his tribute to his adopted new home, England. And The Thunderbolt Kid, his memoir of his childhood. Bill Bryson's a kind of travel writer in all of his books, even if the travel is through the world of science or the history of private life. He brings you along as a kind of companion, and he's determined to enjoy the journey as much as he can. Bill Bryson knows what most people tend to forget, that the world is actually endlessly interesting if you bring some imagination, humour, and a large magnifying glass with you. This conversation with Bill Bryson was recorded in front of a live audience in Melbourne at a fundraising event for the Florey Institute of Neuroscience and Mental Health. Your memoir, The Thunderbolt Kid, it's a bit of a love letter to the era in which you grew up in Des Moines, Iowa. You say quite famously at the beginning that you come from Des Moines because somebody had to. And you say it was a time of this, and a time of atomic toilets. What is an atomic toilet?
Well, I don't know that it was actually atomic, but there was a popular restaurant in Des Moines called Bishop's, which was a buffet, and it was a cafeteria, and it was a great institution, and it was a wonderful place, altogether anyway. But in the basement, in the men's room, presumably in the women's room as well, I just never got in there, but in the men's room, the toilet seat had a famous feature, which was that it went into a slight recess in the wall after it was used. It automatically lifted after you sat on it, went into a recess in the wall, and it was this sort of purple light came on in there, and it was irradiated in some way. And it was, when you're a kid, this is the most magical thing. And it was really what brought home to me kind of the wonders of the atomic age. That this was, because the 50s was a time when people were really excited about the atom, and it was something that wasn't seen as threatening and worrisome. I mean, kind of a nuclear future was something that people were tremendously excited about. And I mean, this was a time when people went to Nevada to watch atomic tests going off, and people would actually, stand there with fallout raining down on them and say, "This is fantastic," So it was a completely different age, but it was also just about the most exciting thing in Des Moines, Iowa.
Your parents were people of the Depression, the Great Depression. They must have been people from a time which looked at the future with dread. And your generation, though, looked at the future with great optimism. Could you sense the difference between that and your parents?
Well, yeah, my parents was, I think this is universal, but everybody who grew up in that period, because it was tough all over the world. My parents grew up not just through the Great Depression, but then the Second World War. So all of their lives, their whole kind of married life, right through into middle age, was dealing with the sort of difficult, challenging conditions in the world. And then the 50s came along, and in America, I believe it was much the same in Australia as well, the 50s was just a fantastic boom period because we had no war damage to recover from. All of American industry was intact and ready to stop producing tanks and armaments and things like that, and just start making washing machines and televisions and wonderful consumer products. And so the 50s became this era that was suddenly fantastically wealthy and successful, and full employment and all of those fabulous things. And I can remember so clearly when people like my parents and people of their generation, they were so excited about that because they'd had 25 years of deprivation leading up to this, and then suddenly everybody could have a refrigerator and a washing machine and a tumble dryer and all of those things, and so because everybody was getting it, certainly everybody in any kind of standard middle class neighborhood was getting all of these things. There wasn't any envy. I can genuinely remember that if your parents got a new refrigerator, all the neighbors would come around and look at it. But there wasn't any envy about it, because the next week the neighbors would have you around to look at their new cooker or whatever. It was just this kind of shared experience. And all the people of my parents' generation were just absolutely knocked out by that. The fact that they had all of this opportunity all of a sudden. It was just the most wonderful thing. But something like that can only last one generation, because the next generation that came along, which was my generation, we wanted everything all the time. We were totally spoiled. There wasn't any sense of wonder and privilege at having these things. It was an entitlement. And I think ever since then, it's been kind of downhill for Western society, because we just, we have this insatiable need to have more stuff all the time, and we cannot be satisfied.
My grandparents never really lost the habits of scarcity from the Great Depression. Were your folks like that too?
Yeah, but not as much as they are in England. I mean, one of those things that I just loved when I first went to England in the 70s was that, if you went into a shop and you bought something and you gave them exact change, and especially if it took a long time to count it out, it was as if they were really grateful, like you were helping with the war effort. This is 30 years after the war has ended, but it was still, I think I've got the exact change here. And there was this sort of feeling that somehow you were kind of mucking in. And it was never quite like that in the States. It was never quite that same thing.
Your parents used to recycle paper plates, wash bits of tin foil. Were you mortified at that?
No, that was just perfectly normal. I'm not sure that was representative of the generation, but more just the kind of person my mother was. But the famous story in our house, and it was a scandal among my brother and sister, was that she kept never threw a jar out, never threw anything out really, but never threw a jar out, washed them all, and put them under the sink. And for some reason in our house, if you were just about to go out and you needed to have a pee, my mother would get out what she called the toity jar. And it was a jar that she kept...
The toity jar?
Toity, T-O-I-T-Y. That was the word in her world for having a pee, a toity. And again, I thought that was what everybody called it. And so, but she would get out this jar that she called the toity jar, and you would have a pee there in the kitchen, and then you would go out of the house. Rather than send you upstairs to do it in the toilet like normal person would, she would have you do it in the kitchen, and she put the toity jar to one side. And I grew up thinking that the toity jar really was a particular jar. And it took me the longest time to realize that very often what had been the toity jar yesterday was actually holding some leftover fruit in the refrigerator. And it kind of dawned on me and my brother and sister all at the same time that actually the toity jar is just any jar. And we sort of got very particular about leftovers after that.
Was there a critical mass of children in your street?
Yeah, and as there were in all streets. I mean, there seemed to be nothing but children. I mean, it was, the great boom years for childbirth in America. I mean, post-war years, everybody was suddenly having babies furiously, and it meant that you grew up with lots and lots of kids all over the neighborhood. I mean, it felt like there were hundreds of kids in our neighborhood, and every time you had a game of any kind, we had a game we called Kick the Can, which was just a sort of open warfare with children. And it really felt like there would be hundreds of kids. I mean, there must have been at least 20 at a minimum, but kids would drift in from other neighborhoods or from other streets all around. It was fantastic. And now when you go outside, wherever you are in the world, and you go in any residential street, there are no children out. I'm sure it's the same here. It's certainly the case in America. It's certainly the case in Britain. And you go out and you just think, where are all the kids? And you realize that they're all inside somewhere looking at some kind of a screen.
I had a street full of kids, and as a result, as a kid, you feel you own the streets then, and it's your domain. It's not an adult's domain that you're treading on.
You own the streets, and you own any home that's under construction, that's yours, and any building anywhere, anything that's on the property and isn't actually secured or locked away, that's yours too. And a bucket of nails, wow, that's mine now. And just anything like that. That was all part of growing up. I mean, we didn't do anything horrible with it. We just made fun with it.
I want to quote a lovely line from your book where you say, you knew more things in your first 10 years than at any time since. And you say, I knew the cool feel of linoleum on bare skin and what everything smelt like at floor level. I knew pain the way you know it when it is fresh and interesting. The pain, for example, of a toasted marshmallow in your mouth when its interior is roughly the temperature and consistency of magma. I knew exactly how clouds drifted on a July afternoon, what rain tasted like, how ladybugs preened and caterpillars rippled, what it felt like to sit inside a bush.
Partly because we had so little artificial stimulation. We didn't have all of these electronic toys and things that I mean, it sounds pathetic when you say we had to go out and make our own fun and everything, but and sometimes it was pathetic. I mean, it was often very boring. There was, we didn't have the same stuff to do, which is why, you end up sitting in a bush. But at the same time, there is quite a lot of something quite wonderful about that. The fact that, the childhood is so slow and it just goes on forever and you have so much time and you can actually take the time to explore things. And because you are small and down at ground level, the things that go on down there, anything to do with insects and anything that's moving around down there, you know it and you see it in a way that you never do when you're an adult because, we're all 6 feet away from it now. And I think there's a great pity in that. And I would like to think that kids still get some of that. They must surely, just by being small and being kind of fresh, seeing all this stuff for the first time.
There's a lovely sense in your book of you didn't realise how embarrassing your family could be until, of course, someone points it out to you. Your dad was a fan of isometric exercises. Explain how that works and where he would like to practice this form of exercise.
It was this thing that came out, the Royal Canadian Air Force in the early 1960s. It came up with this program of isometrics, which was all based on the idea of you did exercises by pushing as hard as you could against some unyielding surface, like a wall. And they had this book, it was a kind of ridiculous book, because it just pictures of people, like pushing on a floor, pushing on a wall, pushing on... And my dad used to love to do it on airplanes. And because he would get stiff and you'd go on these long flights, and he would go to the back of the airplane, usually back by the galley where the stewardesses were busy doing stuff, and he would be pushing on the side of the plane as if he was trying to push a hole in it, as if he was trying to push his way out or push on the door. And he'd be grunting and sort of doing all these things. And it was just, I was like 13 years old, and it was just mortifying to see him doing that. And then he would stop and explain it to people. If they were watching, he would start explaining to them as if they, thinking that they'd be really interested. And then they would just look at him as if he was crazy.
Your dad was a sports writer. Did that mean you travelled with him to baseball games around the United States?
Sometimes. I mean, I was really, really lucky. It was a very privileged childhood in that sense. My dad was a small town, it's a small city, minor league city newspaper, but he was a really, really good writer, a very, very good sports writer, and kind of known in the business as being a very good writer, and particularly good at writing baseball stories. And he loved baseball, and he was kind of respected in the baseball community. And so he used to go off every summer and do little trips to major league cities usually around the Midwest, like Chicago or Detroit or St. Louis. And he would generally take me with him, and it was tremendously exciting because, not only did I get to go to the games, but he would go down on the field beforehand and interview the players, and I would get to go down there with him. And people that were, absolute gods to me when I was a kid, I would get to be there with them. And there was a baseball player named Ernie Banks who was just the loveliest man, one of the greatest baseball players ever. And I got to sit beside Ernie Banks in the Chicago Cubs dressing room one time, and he was autographing baseballs. They'd get big boxes of baseballs, and he would take one out and autograph it and put it in another box. He'd empty one box and fill in the next one. And I got to sit in the chair beside him, and I would get to hand him the baseball, and he'd say, "Thank you," and he'd do that, and I'd hand him another. He'd say, "Thank you," and it was just, this is like me, as I say in the book, it was just like me being friends with God, I'm handing this guy baseballs, and he's saying thank you. He was a really, really nice guy. And so getting to do that, just having that as part of my memory is fantastically lucky.
It was at this age of contentment, but there was also a lot of anxiety in that period of American history. All sorts of things were starting to bubble up to the surface throughout the 1950s. Did you have a sense of that?
No, not at all. Not until the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was the first time I noticed that I really realized that the world was a scary place. And then quite soon after that, or at least it seemed quite soon to me, the Kennedy assassination. And those were the two kind of really shocking, chilling events of my early years. You knew that these things were going on in the background. You could hear your parents talking. You could hear, my dad was a Democrat, and he'd get really angry about things like the Army McCarthy hearings, and he hated Richard Nixon, and all. There was a lot of kind of anger there, but it was just your dad sounding off sort of thing. It wasn't like it was something that affected us personally. You knew that some people were building fallout shelters in their back gardens and that kind of thing, but it never occurred to you that this would actually ever really happen. We used to have to do the drills at school where you'd have to get down on your hands and knees under your desk in case of a nuclear attack. And I can remember clearly thinking when I was in third grade, this is not going to save my life, you know, just because I'm under the desk rather than sitting at it, you know. And I knew what a nuclear warhead could do. But it never in a million years did it occur to you that this would actually happen. It wasn't until much, much later that I learned, from my dad just casually mentioned to me when I was early teenagers, that actually one of the first targets would be Omaha, because it was the Strategic Air Command headquarters, and that would be one of the very first targets, and any fallout from that would drift across Des Moines within 90 minutes. So we would all be, you know, kind of killed in our homes. So actually we were in harm's way, but I had no sense of that when I was growing up.
How is Des Moines different now? What do you think and feel about the Des Moines of today compared to
in every way, it's changed, and it's almost entirely for the worse, I'm sorry to say. You know, I'm even trying to allow for the fact that you tend to look back fondly on these things and distort them in a favorable way. It was pretty close to perfect, I think, in the 50s. It really was. You had a vibrant downtown. Every town in America was like this. You know, you had your own stores and department stores. They weren't parts of national chains. I mean, national chains barely existed where I was a kid. So, you know, you went for clothes, you went to Frankel's, the men's clothing store, and for the department store was Yonkers. It wasn't Macy's or some part of a national chain. And that made every town individual, and every restaurant was local and individual. So the food was, you know, you didn't ever know what, you knew what you were going to get in your own town, but when you traveled, you didn't know quite what you were going to get. And it made every place much more interesting. And, you know, so your, you know, Bishop's, this place I was talking about, their chocolate pie was fantastic, and it was the best I've ever had. And now that Bishop's is gone, you can't, you know, it's that chocolate pie is gone as well. And so the kind of all of those things that were special and individual about a city like Des Moines have pretty well gone now. And the downtown in Des Moines, which was very vibrant when I was growing up there, and full of movie theaters with giant screens and these wonderful sort of picture palaces. So the Paramount Theater in Des Moines was the biggest movie theater between Chicago and Denver, and it was, you know, something that people were really proud of. And it was enormous, and to sit in there watching a movie was a magical, really magical experience, because you're watching it on like a 50-foot screen in this gigantic cubic acre of space. It was just a wonderful experience, and all that stuff is gone now. It's all been torn down and taken away and replaced with things that are suburban and involve shopping malls, and I find that really sad.
You initially came into prominence through travel writing predominantly. It's unusual for Americans to travel. We know that Americans typically have a lower rate of passport ownership. They've built their own Venice in the middle of Las Vegas rather than risk meeting an Italian. And you come from one of these nice, safe, contented places in America. Why did you leave? Why did you get out and see the world?
Because I really wanted to. I mean, I can remember from an early age, I think my earliest clear memories in life of looking at National Geographics and being absolutely transfixed by photographs, mostly of places in Europe, but sometimes, you know, it could be New Zealand or Australia, but places that seem far away, and you know how there's this sort of unbelievably rich, lush photographs in National Geographic, how good they made everywhere look. And just, you know, so an article about anything, it just made the world look like it was really, really fabulous everywhere compared with where we were. I mean, it just looked so much more interesting and varied and dynamic. So I grew up with a powerful, powerful urge to want to go out and see the world.
What happens when you write about a place, Bill? Does it change the place for you?
That's a really good question. In a way, I don't know. I mean, I always try to write accurately about the places that I've been to. I mean, I try really hard, but what you find is that memory is a really tricky thing, and that it often plays tricks on you. I mean, I noticed that when I did the Thunderbolt Kid, I told, completely honestly from memory, an experience about going on a summer vacation with a family, and I can't even remember quite what the elements of the story were now, but I wrote it as a story, totally truthfully, as far as I knew. My sister read the book, and she said, you know, that chapter, she said, that was actually 2 different vacations. One of them was to New York, and one of them was to Colorado. And you've conflated those 2 experiences into one. And I did it completely honestly. You know, I'm 6 years younger than her, so my memory obviously was a little less well-formed than hers, or my position was a little less mature. But that's the kind of thing that happens. I find happens all the time. That you write about things thinking you're writing about them honestly. So I don't know if this is answering your question, but it turns out that you have actually been quite wrong in some fundamental way. But I figure, well, what the hell, That's...
We're doing this conversation in Melbourne. Melbourne's my hometown. I haven't lived here for about a decade or so, but I always have mixed reactions when I come back. I'm kind of delighted by the changes and progress that's made, but another part of me bitterly resents that people have gotten on with their lives without me. It's really stupid and narcissistic. Do you feel that way about the places you've lived in and have left behind?
Yeah, well, it's always, it is always tough to go back again. I don't think there's any place I've ever lived that I've gone back to and thought it has got better. And I think you just have to realize that's
once they lose the Bryson magic, they go quickly downhill.
But I don't think it's just because I've gone away. But things move on. And, I remember we've gone a couple of times to our first home, which was just a little bungalow, just a totally undistinguished bungalow on the south coast of England in Christchurch, in Dorset, or just outside. My first job was with an evening newspaper in Bournemouth. And it was our first house. And it was just a tiny two-bedroom bungalow, but we loved it, and we fussed over it, and we planted a tree in the garden, and it was like you would with your first house. And then we went back later and discovered that the people had taken out the garden and just made it all hard standing out front, and they'd taken the little glassed-in porch off, and it was just they hadn't trashed it, but they had just made it to their own tastes in a way that just seemed quite.
Did you hate those people at that moment?
Yeah, I did, really. Obviously it's their house and they're free to do what they want.
No, but that's too reasonable, isn't it? It's your house, you planted the tree.
It was disappointing, and we've had that same experience. I'm sure all of us have had that experience. You go back to a house that you used to live in, or a place that used to be important to you, and you discover that somebody's done something to it that you really wish they hadn't done. But, that's life, I suppose.
You don't like driving, famously averse to it. Do people think you're mad for not driving?
They do in America. They really do. We moved in 1995. We moved back to the States for a while, mostly just to give our kids the experience of it. And I have 4 children, and I'd always felt very lucky that I'd got to divide my life between 2 different countries, and I thought, well, we should give our children some of that while they're young and going through all their formative years. And so slightly impulsively, we moved back to America and settled down there in a wonderful little town in New Hampshire, and we were, on the whole, very happy. But I did find certain things were really strange. So one was I would often go walking. I sit at my desk in the house all day long. I haven't been out in the fresh air. I just work at home. And so, by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I would often want to walk into town and go to the library or go to the post office or run errands. And you can't do that in America. As soon as somebody sees you walking, as a neighbor passes, they think that your car must be in the shop or something, and they all want to stop and give you a lift, and they can't believe, so it's been more time stopping and talking to people, telling them, no, I'm walking because I like to use my legs. It's an enjoyable experience. Our next-door neighbor there used to drive into town to go on a walking machine in a gym. And I just said, I can't assimilate that. How do you do that? And I said to her, why do you do that? And she said, well, then, I have a program with the machine. It tells me how fast I'm going and how many calories I've burnt and everything. And I just said, why don't you walk to the machine and spend 10 minutes less on the machine? She didn't think that made sense.
You wrote that really lovely, generous book about Australia that was published here in the name of Down Under. As I was reading that, I was thinking of a thing that John Button once said. John Button was a former federal senator in Australia and a government minister. And he once mentioned in an interview with me that Australia and the United States have about 90% in common, but the 10% that's different is really different. It's completely different. What do you think of that?
Yeah. And I think the thing that's really different is the sense of humor. I think the thing that sets America apart from all the other English-speaking nations is sense of humor. All the other English-speaking nations have essentially the same sense of humor, and America doesn't. And it's all based along that whole idea of the kind of, irony and understatement and those sort of little dry quips. And there's a true story I can tell you that perfectly illustrates it. When we moved back to New Hampshire, I would make those little jokes like you make with strangers every day, and for the first time in my life, they were falling flat. And I remember a neighbor of ours, he'd had a tree come down in a storm one night. It was just a sort of small tree. It had come down in a storm one night. And when I came out of the house in the morning, he was cutting it up into smaller pieces and putting the pieces on the roof of his car to take away for disposal. But it was a kind of bushy tree, and the pieces were all hanging over the sides of the car. So I just said to him, as you do, I said, "Good morning, Ted. I see you're camouflaging your car." and he looked at me and he said, "No, we had a tree come down the storm last night." And after a while, you realize you cannot make these jokes with people. And interestingly, you could make those jokes in Iowa. People in Iowa had exactly what the sense of humor, all kind of making fun of yourself, not taking things too seriously, being dry and ironic. The joke like that would go down fine there, but in New England, it didn't work at all.
In America, they say things like, "Oh, that's funny," but they don't laugh.
Yeah, very often. Yeah. I remember another time with this guy. I'd had some terrible travel experience where everything went wrong because of storms all over the middle part of the country, and I was trying to fly from Los Angeles back to Boston. And I came in, I was hours and hours late, and I was just telling him about it. And he said, "Who did you fly with?" And I said, "I don't know, they were all strangers." And he didn't get that either. So eventually I just stopped making jokes like that.
Conversations with Richard Fidler. On air, online, and podcast.
Today it's a conversation with writer Bill Bryson, recorded at an event for the Florey Institute of Neuroscience and Mental Health in front of a live audience in Melbourne. I think my favourite book of yours is, and I think it's your most recent one, is At Home, which is a history of private life. And even that title really doesn't even do that justice. There's so much in it it's so lovely and incredibly rich. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
And one of the stories that comes out of it for me that's completely lovely and surprising is that it seems that modern science was invented in the Victorian era by vicars of leisure. Tell me how you uncovered this and discovered this.
Well, the reason that became a feature of the story is because our house is an old rectory. It was built in 1851. And the whole idea of the book was that I had it in mind that I joked to my wife for a long time that the next book I did would be a book where I wouldn't leave home. I wouldn't have to go off traveling. And so I got this idea that I would just travel around my own house and go from room to room and write a history of the world based on each room, so that the bathroom would be a history of hygiene and the kitchen would be a history of cooking and so on. Whatever was relevant to those rooms would be the feature of history that I would talk about. And because it was a rectory, an old rectory, it was important to set the scene for me to look into the lives of vicars and clergymen in Victorian England. And 1851 was the year of the Great Exhibition. And it turned out, I didn't know this at all, but it turned out it was a fantastic time because Church of England vicars, they were usually younger sons of wealthy people. They came from privileged backgrounds. All of them, every single one of them, had been educated at Oxford or Cambridge, so they'd had good, sound educations. And it was quite a well-paid position, and they had lots and lots of time on their hands. I mean, mostly they had, they just were looking after parishes that maybe only had, 60 or 70 families. So not a lot going on. They had to give one sermon a week and occasionally bury or marry somebody. And that was about all they had to do. So they had lots and lots of time on their hands, and they were smart, and they were well off. So what happened was that you had, for a period of about 60 or 70 years, on either side of mid-19th century, you had all of these clergymen doing fantastically original, inventive things. I mean, Charles Darwin himself almost became a clergyman. He very likely would have been one of them himself. But lots of them, I mean, I can barely remember all of them, but the person who bred the Jack Russell Terrier, the person who invented the submarine, there was a clergyman, an English clergyman, country clergyman. Lawrence Sterne, the guy who wrote The Life and Times of Tristram Shandy, was a clergyman when he did that. And then lots and lots of people who were the children of clergymen, Jane Austen and so on. So it was this incredibly rich, productive, made huge difference to what was known and discovered in Victorian England, because you had this whole class of very wealthy, slightly idle, but intelligent people that were just, almost all of the people that were like experts on spiders and lichen and mosses and all of those things, they were almost exclusively clergymen in the 19th century.
And bit by bit, they went out and unpicked the thread of their faith. That's the other thing, isn't it? Bit by bit, and Darwin, of course, being the most obvious example here, they unpicked the whole fabric of what they believed to be the revealed truth from the Bible.
And they certainly made the modern Church of England what it is, which is, it isn't, compared with a lot of other more fundamental religions, it isn't actually very religious. And I think it has a lot to do with 19th century clergymen who weren't terribly religious themselves usually.
There's just a lovely little capsule sort of description. And this is one of the things I love about this book. You just stumble on this. This is a paragraph with no stress on it in particular, but you're referring to one man here called John Lubbock, who grew up as a neighbour of Charles Darwin's, you write. I'm just quoting you here. Upon reaching adulthood, Lubbock followed his father into banking, but his heart was in science. He was a tireless, if slightly eccentric, experimenter. Once he spent 3 months trying to teach his dog to read. Developing an interest in archaeology, he learned Danish because Denmark was then the world leader in the field. He had a particular interest in insects and kept a colony of bees in his sitting room, the better to study their habits. I'd love to know that guy.
And he was also the guy that invented the bank holiday. They were called Lubbock Days at first, as I recall, and he was a national hero. I mean, at the time of his death, he was greatly mourned and was much, much more famous than lots of other figures that we know well now.
There's lots of little factoids in your book as well. As you went on a walk through around Norfolk, where you live at the moment with your friends, you came to realise why it is that a lot of the old churches of Norfolk appear to be sunken into the ground.
Yeah, that was, to me, was quite a revelation. A very good friend of ours, he's now retired, but he was at that time the county archaeologist in Norfolk. And when I told him I was doing this book, he came out to have a look around. And for me, coming from Iowa, coming from a young country, what he was saying to me, because he brought a map of all the stuff that had been found, archaeological stuff that had been found in the vicinity, and there were various symbols for whether it was Roman or Saxon or Viking or whatever. And the map of our area was just covered in little triangles and circles and things that representing various things that had been found, just in one little tiny parish of Norfolk. That was quite amazing. And then he took me to the churchyard, which is next door to our house, because our house is the old rectory. And just as we were looking around, he pointed out to me that the church was sunk slightly into the ground, as if something heavy had been put in a cake pan. And he said, "You know why that is?" And I said, "Well, no idea, but I was thinking it had sunk for some reason." He says, "It isn't because the church is sunk, it's because the ground around it is built up, because there's just such a mass of bodies have been put into it over time." And he calculated roughly that probably in that churchyard was 20,000 bodies. And this is in a parish with 66 people in it now, and it hasn't ever really had more than about 100 at a time. But because it's an old church, if you just think about the number of people who die over the course of a century and multiply it by the number of the centuries that a church has been there, there's a huge amount of mass, both bodies, but also the coffins and other things that are put in there. And that builds up the ground around it to a height of usually about 3 feet.
You love Britain, and you've returned to Britain now. And what is it that really makes you feel comfortable and at home in Britain?
Well, that's a good question, but I mean, because I've lived there so long and it's been part of my life for so long, I don't actually think about it. I mean, it just seems completely natural to be there in the way when you wake up in your houses in the morning, it just feels natural to be there. You don't say to yourself, why do I live on Acacia Avenue? You just do. You have for a long time. It becomes a normal part of your life. So in that sense, to answer a question, I have to really stop and think. And really, there's a lot of things I like about Britain. I mean, I admire a lot of things. One is the sense of humor we talked about. I think that's, for an American, that's a particularly delightful and rich thing. I also really admire the fact that there's just such a density of history there, that every 100 feet there's some extremely significant thing has happened. It's the most incredibly inventive and productive nation, and that it feels old. I mean, I just like old walls and old, the sense of just roads that look as if they've been there for centuries, and little humpback bridges and all that. I really appreciate that very much.
Norman Davies, the historian who wrote the history of Europe, wrote a wonderful volume, it came out some years ago, called The Isles, and it's a history of the British Isles. And the very final thing in the book is he quotes you. He quotes you, and he quotes you. This is what you wrote about Britain. You wrote, "Britain is a country that fought and won a noble war, dismantled a mighty empire in a generally benign and enlightened way, created a far-seeing welfare state, in short, did nearly everything right, and then spent the rest of the century looking on itself as a chronic failure. The fact is that this is still the best place in the world for most things: to post a letter, go for a walk, watch television, buy a book, venture out for a drink, go to a museum, use the bank, get lost, seek help, or stand on a hillside and take in a view.
And you know what? If you write stuff like that, then they give you an OBE. The book that most amazed me to just have it done was A Walk in the Woods, which is my book about trying to hike the Appalachian Trail. Because the whole time we were out there, nothing was happening. Everything was going wrong. The guy was hiking with his friend of mine named Stephen Katz in the book. In reality, he was very, very gloomy. The relationship had just broken up. He was struggling with recovering from alcoholism. His life was a mess. And every night when we'd finish walking, I thought we were going to sort of sit around a campfire and have great time telling stories. And he would just, in depression, he would just get into his little tent and go to sleep. And then the whole day, he'd just spend the whole day, we were walking, just bitching about everything. And so nothing was happening, and I thought, I'm never going to, oh, God, let's just quit, because I'm never going to get a book out of this. And when eventually I did get a book out of it, I thought, that's a miracle. That's an absolute, I can't believe that So in a way, that was the one that I've always had the greatest fondness for, because I know what the experience was like, and what a kind of hellish experience it was to go through, and the fact that I eventually got a book out of it felt really good. The book that's been the best for me, and has taken me the most places, is without a doubt A Short History of Nearly Everything. That's the one that sold the best in more countries in the world, and it's because of that book that I get invited places like this.
Having gone from emptying your mind entirely about the history of the universe and everything in it, there are kind of several amazing things you came out with in that. The first thing was that all of us exist. It's a very unlikely business that we exist at all, isn't it?
It is the most amazing thing. I mean, if you just stop and think about it, and that out of all the unbelievable unimaginable numbers of drifting particles and atoms in the universe, some of them have come together to make you. And for a few tens of years, you get to have this fantastic privilege to exist, to get up and move around and see and think and do. And it is the most marvelous thing. And a life is over in an instant. It's bounded by two extremely long eternities, and then there's just us for a little moment in the middle. And it amazes me to think that so much of our lives, we don't even bother to think about that. And most people, I think, go through their whole lives without even reflecting once upon the fact that what an amazing gift it is just to exist. So that is, to me, the single most remarkable fact there is. That was the one thing that doing the research for the book made me appreciate.
This person met that person over centuries, over centuries, over centuries.
Your existence is in many ways a miracle. I mean, just the fact that you exist at all is a miracle. But it's also the fact, you think about how incredibly lucky you have been in a reproductive sense, that every one of your ancestors, every single one of them, all the way back to, the days when they were just something in some unicellular blob in some bubbling mud pot somewhere. But every single one since, for 3 billion years has bred successfully, found a mate, has kind of had that look in their eye at exactly the right moment to create a whole line of descendants that could only eventually end up in you. And then final things that really makes it special is the fact that you have this incredible instrument inside your head that allows you to appreciate having your existence. And again, these are all obvious facts, but I think very often we go through life without stopping to reflect upon them. So what I learned from doing the book, in a strange way, was that the most amazing things are the simplest, the most elemental, in a way, the ones that I least needed to go out and interview scientists to figure out. But having interviewed all the scientists and having done all the reading and having done all the learning I did, it was because of that I came, I was sort of brought back to these very elemental conclusions that the most wonderful things in the universe are really the simplest.
I know in the course of your research you sort of came upon that idea that's called the Theanthropic Principle, that says the idea behind that is that everything about the universe seems to be designed to reach a point where consciousness can exist. Like if the universe, the Big Bang had occurred at a couple of degrees hotter or colder, planets couldn't have formed, life couldn't have evolved on it, and everything about this moment seems to have been prepared for us almost in a way. Is that a useful way of thinking about things, or is it just too narcissistic, too insisting on seeing the world through human eyes?
I think anything that gives you a sense of wonder is a good thing. It's probably wrong to put ourselves at the center of the universe and to think that it's all happened just so that we could all be sitting here now.
It's like a lottery winner saying, I must have been fated to win the lottery.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, I think one of the basic theories that's out there now is that there could be an infinite number of universes or a near infinite number of universes, in which case we just happen to live in the one that was built in a way that was likely to produce beings like us. I mean, where everything that is out there actually suits us, and is likely to produce some sort of a life form like us. But that there would be other universes that are completely different, that might have produced totally different kinds of life forms that would be totally alien to us. But the fact is, if you just go out tonight and look up at the sky and look how empty that sky is and how small the Earth is as a part of it, and I think you've got to feel pretty lucky to be here. I've never been a spiritual person. I'm not a churchgoer. I'm not drawn to that way of thinking. But the thought that did strike me in doing the book was that there's certainly nothing at all inconsistent with conventional science that would be inconsistent with profound religious belief. And that was slightly a surprise to me, because I'd never really stopped to think about it. But one of the things that did strike me in doing the book is that people who have these kind of very conservative fundamentalist Christians who insist that the universe is 10,000 years old and that every word in the Bible is literal truth and so on, I think they're really shortchanging themselves, because if you look at the history of the universe from a conventional scientific perspective, it's a much more awesome and amazing place, full of wonder. The fact that it is so vast. I mean, if you're a believer in God, the fact that it is so enormous, and there's just us, as far as we know, that kind of would lead you to a belief in God much more than the forbidding, ferocious person that the Bible sometimes presents. And so I've never really quite understood why there is this great antagonism among a lot of people of conservative nature to conventional science, and why they feel that somehow things like evolution are antagonistic to their interpretation of religion, because I don't think it should be at all. I think it should actually bolster profound religious belief if you're inclined to have that in the first place.
How many times were you shocked by the untruths, the lies, in fact, that were foisted upon us as students by graphic designers?
I presume you're talking about the illustrations of the planets. And I just came across one the other day, and I saw it, and what they always do in the illustrations of the planets, well, they try to draw them to scale and give you, but what they always do is they have them equidistant, and on any sort of poster or double-page spread. And always, and I saw this just the other day, always the artists put them so close together that they actually cast shadows on each other. And in reality, the scale of the solar system is something that most people, even scientists, have almost no concept of, because it is so vast. I mean, our own solar system is so vast that the Oort cloud, which is the outermost part of it, beyond Pluto, that last kind of belt of planetoids that are out there, the Oort system is 50,000 times further from the Sun than the Earth is from the Sun. It's so far out that there isn't any realistic prospect that we will ever leave our own solar system. That no matter how advanced we get, no matter how good we get at building rocket ships and things, we will never build anything. We just can't build anything that would travel fast enough to allow us to escape our own solar system. So we are totally locked in here. For us, that's all there is just our own solar system. And then when you start thinking about how big space is beyond that, it's just staggering. And there isn't any real way that you could convey that you certainly couldn't in a double-page spread in the book. You can't convey that scale.
Given those distances, though, do you think that means that ultimately we're never going to encounter another alien intelligence?
Well, the one thing I can absolutely guarantee you is that if an alien race ever comes to Earth, they're not going to just come down and abduct some guy in a pickup truck in North Dakota and take him away. I mean, I think they'll actually make contact. I think the likelihood is, but the spaces are so vast that unless there's some means of teleportation or something that we cannot imagine, there isn't any way that any creatures could get together across space. Just having any kind of conversation, if we discovered life elsewhere in the universe, I don't know how they figure these things, but they figure the average distance between advanced civilizations would be at least 200 light years, which means that if we send a message to them, it would take 200 years for it to get there, and any reply they gave would be 200 years coming back. You couldn't possibly have any meaningful communication with them, much less actually ever shake their hands.
Because we're neither of us scientists, we can talk about theories that we'd like as opposed to those that are true, necessarily. Remember in the 80s and the 90s there was talk there would be a grand unified theory in physics. There'd be a theory which would unite relativity and quantum mechanics. Does the very idea of that appeal to you or dismay you? That we'd have a theory that would explain the whole universe?
I would personally be satisfied and happy for there to be a grand unifying theory. It just seems as if it ought to be simple. There's something kind of wonderfully elegant about simplicity. The most wonderful formula in the world, equation in the world, is E equals mc squared. I really don't know what that means. I mean, I really don't, barely grasp it, and I spend a lot of time trying to understand what that means. But you only have to look at it to see, this is fantastic. I mean, this explains a huge amount with just those simple elements. And it seems as if all of physics, or all of any science, ought to somehow come down to that kind of wonderful, marvelous, revelatory simplicity. But it looks, with physics anyway, it looks as if it's not going to be like that. It gets messier and messier, and they find, a Higgs boson and other things like that, and it doesn't have a wonderful simplicity. It's kind of quite messy.
That pleases me.
Yeah, good. I'm glad it does.
I like an untidy universe.
Oh, good. I'm glad it does.
Yeah. One of the things I think you always bring to your writing is that driving curiosity. Do you ever get a sense you run out of things to find interesting, run out of things that would engage that kind of motor within you, that little curious motor?
No, I hope not, because then you'd be dead, wouldn't you? I mean, even if I stopped writing about things, I could imagine I would sort of run out of energy necessary to go off and do these things. But I would hope that I would still be curious enough to want to keep learning and reading and finding things out. I mean, that's what life's all about, surely.
It surely is. Bill, it's been such a pleasure speaking with you. You've been such a wonderful man and so generous as well. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Bill Bryson. Thank you so much, Bill.
That was fantastic. Thank you very much.
That's Bill Bryson, author of many books, including At Home, Notes from a Small Island, and A Short History of Nearly Everything. Many thanks to Amanda and the team at the Florey Institute for inviting us to be part of their evening with Bill Bryson.